Hello everyone. My name is Dr. Shagun Saklani Pandey and I am a faculty with the School of Social Work at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. The title of today's module is Child Trafficking and this comes under the paper on criminology. Child trafficking is a heinous crime that is being committed against women and children across the globe. The Southeast Asian countries have been more vulnerable to situations of child trafficking. India is also no exception to it. With this agenda today, we will be looking at this module on child trafficking. This module has been categorized into various sections. In the first section, we will be looking at an overall introduction on human trafficking. We will then look into what child trafficking is, how do we define child trafficking, and what are some of the situation analysis of child trafficking in India per se. We shall also be looking at some of the legal measures that are in place for the protection of children and women against child trafficking. We shall then be winding up the module with some concluding thoughts that will give you an overall picture of this grim crime that is being committed against children in India. Let us begin with the first section. Herein, we will be looking at what human trafficking means. Into the history, we see many such forms of exploitation that have affected people over decades and centuries. Slavery system was one of them. Slaves were actually treated as property and the owners of these slaves had an absolute right over them. However, one can say that slavery has been abolished for over 200 years now. But we can also say that there are different forms of slavery that still continue. Human trafficking, prostitution of women, bonded labor, etc. still continue to be some forms of slavery. Also, trafficking is often looked at through the lens of prostitution of women and children, families continuing to work with generations and generations with employers, forced child labor, cross-border trafficking of women and children, etc. It is also very important to understand that when we talk of human trafficking, it also brings out that women and children continue to be one of the most vulnerable sections of the society. Now we shall be defining what human trafficking is. The Immoral Trafficking Prevention Act, the ITPA Act of 1956, was the only law in force that talked about trafficking. However, amendment to these laws have been much overdue. The ITPA Act, however, deals with only prostitution as one of the forms of trafficking. The UN Office of Drugs and Crime 2000, known as the UN Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially in women and children, supplementing the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime 2000. This particular protocol was adopted in a city called Palermo in Italy, and that is why this particular protocol is also commonly known as the Palermo Protocol. India signed this protocol in 2002. However, it was ratified by India only in 2011. Trafficking was then for the first time looked at as an organized crime and not just a phenomena. Palermo Protocol, however, has its own limitations. It talks about only cross-border trafficking as one of the forms of trafficking in its definition. The Palermo Protocol defines trafficking as trafficking in persons shall mean the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring or receipts of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Exploitation shall include at a minimum the exploitation of the prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor and services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude or removal of organs. Child shall mean any person who comes under the age of 18. However, we shall also now look into the various definitions that exist on child trafficking in India. It's interesting to see there is no clear-cut definition of trafficking that still exists in India. However, there have been many campaigns on child trafficking, and these campaigns and other organizations involved in it have also brought out some of the definitions. It will be interesting if we look at some of these relevant definitions in the field of child trafficking in India. One of the organizations called HUC, a child rights based organization, has launched a campaign against child trafficking. This particular campaign has been a great success, and it also brought out a very important definition on child trafficking. It states the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring or receipt of person below the age of 18 years within or across borders legally or illegally by means of threat or use of other forms of coercion, of abduction, of deception, of the abuse of power or of position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of such persons with the intention or knowledge that is likely to cause or lead to exploitation. It is very interesting to see that this particular definition brought out the words like legal and illegal into its definition. This particular definition also talks about not just cross-border trafficking, but also trafficking that occurs within the borders in a country. The other important definition that was brought out in the field of child trafficking in India is by the Save the Children Alliance. It states that trafficking would mean all acts of recruitment, transportation, purchase, sale, transfer, receipt or harboring of a person, including a child as defined by the UNCRC, within or across borders that include the use of deception, coercion or debt bondage, whether or not any payment is given or received for the purpose of placing or holding such persons in involuntary services or servitude, domestic, sexual or reproductive, in forced or bonded labor, in slavery-like condition or for false adoption. In this particular definition, we see that many other forms of exploitation that are often one of the major causes of trafficking are also listed. Some of them are the debt bondage, forced bonded labor and other slavery-like conditions. Another important definition of child trafficking has been brought out by the International Labour Organization. It states that child trafficking is about taking children out of their protective environment and preying on their vulnerability for the purpose of exploitation. This particular definition actually talks about a macro level creation of an environment wherein every child is protected. We shall now be looking into the other section that talks about child trafficking situations, particularly in India. It will actually help us to understand what is the situation of children when it comes to child trafficking in India. Child trafficking has emerged as one of the most heinous crimes against children in India, not just in the recent times but also in the past. India is usually considered as a point of source, transmit and destination for trafficking on women and children. The whole idea of source, transmission and destination is very integral to trafficking. I shall be covering this in more details in the coming sections. The US Department of State actually brought out a very interesting study in 2016, wherein it stated that 90% of trafficking in India is internal in nature, and people from the most disadvantaged groups are most vulnerable to child trafficking. There has been a large scale trafficking within different states in India. Some of the states continue to be a hub of trafficking, like that of Rajasthan, West Bengal, etc. There are many reasons that have been stated in this report that have led to this trafficking to be an increase within the country. There have been major reasons like that of rapid urbanization, increased mobility of people, increased demand of labor in different sectors like that of construction, etc., and women and children being lured into getting better jobs. These are some of the reasons why children and women from different states are brought into other states for trafficking. Now we shall be looking into some of the basic elements of child trafficking. It will help us understand what really entails child trafficking. Child under the age of 18 are most vulnerable to becoming victims of child trafficking. It's a myth that it's only girls who are affected by trafficking. It's very important to understand that it's not just girls and women, but boys are also equally vulnerable to trafficking. Children are more often than not aware of being trafficked. They do not have an understanding that they are being trafficked. Coercion or actual force, fraud, deception or allurement are some of the means used for trafficking children. Within this whole situation of trafficking, one also sees an exchange of cash or kind in the process. Children are often subjected to different kind of abuse and exploitation that ranges from sexual abuse, mental abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, etc. Now we shall look at what really are the reasons for trafficking in children, why children are being trafficked in India. Some of the major reasons of trafficking have been listed here. Some of them are that children are trafficked in India for the purpose of labor. This includes bonded labor, domestic work, agricultural labor, construction work, carpet industry, garment industry, fish or shrimp export, as well as other sites of work in the formal and informal economy. Children are also trafficked in India for the purposes of sexual exploitation. These would include forced prostitution, socially and religiously sanctified forms of prostitution, sex tourism and pornography. Some of the other illegal activities are also one of the major reasons for trafficking of children in India. These are begging, organ trade, drug peddling and smuggling. Children are not just being trafficked for these particular reasons, but also for entertainment and sports. Children are often seen to be trafficked for camel jockeying, to participate in circuses and dance troupes, etc. Children are also trafficked for the purpose of child marriage and adoption. In situations of trafficking, there are certain phases involved. Every person or even child who is trafficked goes through these particular phases. These are called source, transit and destination. Source basically means the place from where the first step towards trafficking is taken. This is the place where the child is started in the process of trafficking. These could be his or her home, village, community, and mostly a lot of buying and kidnapping of children also takes place at this particular source. Then a child is put through transit. Transit basically is the midpoint between source and destination. During situations of transit, there are children who are vulnerable to exploitation and abuses of various kinds. Many a times, children are often not told about what is happening to them. They are also given false promises. On the other hand, towards the end of this is the destination. This may include some transaction in cash or kind. Final selling of a child also takes place here. Usually, this is the phase where children are finally exposed to illegal or sexual activities like that of prostitution or forced child labor. Now, it's very important for us to look at what are some of the major reasons for child trafficking in India. Some of the reasons are poverty, food insecurity, globalization, urbanization, displacement due to development, natural calamities, ethnic or political conflict, cultural norms and traditions of a particular community, violation of basic rights of children, lack of political will and limited legal provisions. It's also now important to understand and look at the major impacts of child trafficking that has long-term and short-term impacts on children. It is not wrong to say that trafficking has deep impact on every child. children are being vulnerable sections of the society are often exposed to this heinous crime. Children who are exposed to many short-term and long-term impacts due to victimization during trafficking. Here we shall be looking at some of the major impacts as have been listed down. Some of them are emotional impact that looks at the experiences of transit and other phases of trafficking. It often leaves long-lasting impressions on the minds of children. They may develop low self-esteem, low self-confidence, feeling of continued shame, stigmatization, feeling of betrayal, non-trust, anxiety, sleeplessness, lost hope, depression, and even suicidal tendencies. Children also have to go through many physical impacts during trafficking. It has been observed that a large number of trafficked children are often exposed to sexual exploitation. That often makes them vulnerable to sexually transmitted diseases also. Trafficked children are often forced to work as laborers. This could be at various construction sites, domestic work, etc. Here also, children are often exposed to beating, long working hours, forced hunger or sexual exploitation. Trafficked girls are often exposed to forced marriage and are also vulnerable to sexual exploitation and abuses of other kinds. Often, trafficked children are also forced into begging, and for this they are often maimed to get more sympathy from people. Children also go through some psychosocial impacts. Most of the times, children who are exposed to trafficking often lose out on their education. This also has a long-term impact on them. Many of them are then the earning members of the families. Many of them actually lose out on their childhood. There is a sense of lost identity, feeling of helplessness, disconnect from others, leading to a direct impact on their mental health. So far, we've looked at what trafficking is, what are the various definitions of child trafficking in India, and what is the current situation of child trafficking in India. We've also looked at the major purposes of trafficking, the cause and effects of trafficking, and the impact that trafficking causes on children. We shall now be looking into the various legal measures that are available for protection of children against trafficking. Up till 2013, trafficking was used as interchangeably or as a synonym to prostitution. Some of the reasons for child trafficking, like child labor, pornography, etc., were not listed under any legal document internationally or nationally. India actually ratified two important international instruments and thus brought trafficking under the legal framework. The first ratified convention or protocol was that of the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on Sale of Children, Child Prostitution and Child Pornography that was ratified in August 2005. Protocol to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking in person, especially women, children, supplementing the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, which is popularly known as the Palermo Protocol, was ratified in May 2011. After ratifying Palermo Protocol, the legal framework available in India was also expanded, including the Indian Penal Code that was then amended in 2013. After the 2000 amendment of Section 370 of the Indian Penal Code, trafficking was then defined as following on the definition of Palermo Protocol. Trafficking included the act of recruiting, harboring, transferring or receiving persons for the purpose of exploitation using a range of methods such as threat, force, coercion, fraud, abuse of power and inducement. Exploitation shall include any act of physical exploitation or any form of sexual exploitation, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude or the forced removal of organs, and that the consent of victims in immaterial in determination of the offence of trafficking. After this particular definition was included in the law after the amendment of section 370, there have also been many measures that were taken by the government in this front. Some of them were setting up of anti-trafficking units, advisories and standard operating procedures, and also there has been involvement of the Ministry of Home Ministry. Looking at the UN Office of Drugs and Crime report on 2013 that basically assessed India's situation of human trafficking, it was brought out that despite of strong steps being taken by the government of India, the trafficking rackets and gangs have become more organized and expanded into newer forms of trafficking. The crime has expanded in such a way that today almost every state is affected with this social and criminal menace. Though trafficking for commercial sexual exploitation continues to be an area of concern, lately there has also been an increase in trafficking of women and children for forced labor, bondage and slavery. The optional protocol of the UNCRC on the sale of children, child prostitution and child pornography, which has been ratified by India, is also a major tool in this front. It was adopted due to the increased incidence of child trafficking not just in India but across globe. Children are often trafficked for child prostitution, child pornography, sex tourism and other kinds of sales of children. Here are some of the important and relevant articles that you must know on the optional protocol. Article 5 criminalizes child trafficking and holds the state party responsible for adopting legislations and other measures as may be necessary to establish child trafficking as a criminal offence. Article 6 lays down provisions for protection of victims of trafficking. Article 6 further lays down that state party shall consider implementing measures to provide for the physical, psychological and social recovery of victims of trafficking in person, including in appropriate cases, in cooperation with non-governmental organization, other relevant organization and other element of civil society, and in particular the provision of appropriate housing, counseling and information in particular as regards their legal right, medical, psychological and material assistance, employment, educational and training opportunities. There are other articles also of this optional protocol that may interest you. Interestingly, the amendment of the Indian Penal Code in 2013 came into force after the recommendation of the Justice Verma Committee. It is important for us to learn that Justice Verma Committee was formed after a heinous rape case occurred in India in December 2012. This was popularly now known as the Nirbhaya case. After this particular recommendation by the Justice Verma Committee, the word child was removed and the word minor was replaced. Now the definition of trafficking after this particular amendment included the purpose of exploitation, recruit, transport, harbour, transfers or receives of a person by using threat, using force, by abduction, practicing fraud or deception, by abuse of power or by inducement. The Juvenile Justice Care and Protection Act of 2000 is a major tool that exists in India for protection of children. The JJ Act is a special legal provision laid down for children under the age of 18. The JJ Act is broadly categorized into two broad heads, and children under this Act is covered under these two broad categories. One, children in conflict with law, and second, children in need for care and protection. Children who fall under the category of trafficked children come under the children in need for care and protection. Article 23 of the JJ Act talks about cruelty against children, including assault, abandonment, willful neglect, procurement of a child for any of these in a manner that causes mental and physical suffering to children. The JJ Act actually looks at trafficking through the broad lens of begging and labour. Also, the JJ Act provides institutional and non-institutional measures for rehabilitation of trafficked children. Some of these are foster care, adoption and sponsorship. Interestingly, we also have Goa Children's Act 2003. The state of Goa is the only state in India that had brought out a law to deal with offence against children. This act has not only defined trafficking but also lays down punishment for its perpetrators. Also, this comes in the view because Goa continues to be one of the major hubs for child trafficking. This act lays down the responsibilities on various stakeholders like police, railway police, airport authorities, hotel owners, etc. It's also interesting for all of you to look at some of the important sections that are laid down in the Indian Penal Code. Some of them may not directly talk of trafficking, but they definitely talk about a lot of other exploitation that are major reasons why trafficking takes place in India. For these sections, it's important for you to refer to the module, wherein you will see so many sections that talk of child abuse. And also these are some of the reasons why child trafficking takes place in India. Along with this, there are other relevant acts and international laws in place, and these are often referred to in cases of child trafficking. Some of these laws are the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substance Act of 1985, the Young Persons Harmful Publications Act of 1956, the Information Technology Act of 2000, the Transplantation of Human Organs Act 1994, the UNCRC of 1989, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women 1979, Declaration on Social and Legal Principles relating to the protection and welfare of children with special reference to foster placement and adoption nationally and internationally, the Hague Convention on Protection of Children and Cooperation in Respect of Inter-Country Adoption 1993, and the SARC Convention on Preventing and Combating Trafficking in Women and Children for Prostitution 2000. I would again like to highlight that these acts do not directly talk of trafficking, but these are some of the acts and provisions that are often referred to in cases of trafficking in India and abroad. So far, we have looked at what child trafficking means, what are some of the major reasons for trafficking, how it impacts a child, what is the situation analysis of children in India in terms of trafficking, what are some of the legal measures that are available internationally and nationally for protection of children against this heinous crime of trafficking. This module will also give you an understanding of various sections adopted by the Indian Penal Code that talk about trafficking indirectly also. Now, we shall wrap this up with some concluding thoughts on trafficking. The movement of a human being from one place to another is a universal human right. However, the moment this movement is forced leads to much concern. Trafficking should not only be used interchangeably with prostitution, but has many other dimensions to it. While working in the field of trafficking or researching on a topic of trafficking, one also needs to closely understand the various other dimensions, the various other vulnerabilities that are available in India that affect children. Issues of child labour, forced migration, child marriage, sex tourism, etc. can be looked at as the cause and effect of trafficking. Despite of various national and international measures, it is ironic to see that still child trafficking is a major heinous crime being committed against children. Also, in case of trafficking, governments and other bilateral organizations have laid more focus on the rescue and rehabilitation. However, it is very important that major focus is also laid on the prevention of it. There is a need for a robust system of curbing the causes of child trafficking. In the budgetary allocation, more financial resources need to be available for children, especially for those who are being trafficked in various situations. However, all this would not be possible if there is not an overall change in the social cultural fabric of our country. We need to get rid of the age-old norms, customs and practices that have led to trafficking. Some of these are patriarchy, caste discrimination, girl-child discrimination, poverty, unemployment, globalization, migration, etc. So, in this particular module, we've looked at what child trafficking is, how child trafficking impacts a child emotionally, psychologically, psychosocially, etc. We've also looked at what are the various legal measures that are available in the country and internationally for protection of children who are forced into trafficking. However, it is very important for us to understand that trafficking continues to be one of the most heinous crimes that is being committed against children in India. I hope that this particular module will give you a better understanding on this particular issue of child vulnerability caused out of child trafficking. So, in this particular module on child trafficking, we have aimed to bring out what trafficking means, what this particular phenomenon entails, and how it affects children. The different sections of this module have helped you to understand what child trafficking is, what are the various impacts of child trafficking on children, what are the various causes and effects of child trafficking in India, and how child trafficking continues to be one of the most heinous crimes in today's time. We have also tried to look at the various legal measures that are available nationally and internationally for protection of children against trafficking. You must refer to the module for more detailed understanding of the various sections, provisions and legal measures that are laid down by the international and the national legal systems. It's highly recommended that you go through all the amendments of the Indian Penal Code and the various sections that are laid down in the module to get a better understanding of trafficking as a whole and also some of the other reasons of trafficking. However, it's very important to understand that many a times we fail to get any specific section on trafficking. This also is a major reason why trafficking is often looked at through the lens of other crimes and abuses that are done against children. I hope this module will give you a better understanding of this particular phenomena of trafficking or child trafficking in India per se. Thank you.